Hi, we're here with Dr. Stephen Collins from TSU. That's Trinity Southwest University. Good, got it right. Instead of me telling you a little bit about Steve, that's actually my first question. Steve, welcome and thanks for coming. Dr. Collins, can I call you Steve?
Always.
Okay, good. So tell us a little bit how you got interested in, tell us a little bit about your background, your journey academically and professionally as an archaeologist.
Well, I started out in academically here at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque, studying many things, anthropology mostly.
What year was that?
And oh my goodness, that was, I suppose we could put that in some archaeological context, like the Bronze Age or something. But back in the 60s, you know, 60s, early 70s. Then went on to graduate school at one of the major theological seminaries, majoring in biblical studies and biblical history and languages. And then went on eventually to do a couple of doctorates in the same. So most of my archaeology has come out of studying biblical history, biblical archaeology with a biblical background and a biblical view.
That was your undergrad years here at the University of New Mexico.
And on to my graduate studies as well.
I see.
So I'm anthropology, and then on top of that, biblical studies, biblical history, ancient history. And most of my archaeology I learned the hard way in the field.
You're a scholar. I mean, a lot of us here, I myself have attended your classes. You're my Greek teacher in Greek 1 and 2, and you're...
You did well.
Oh, good, thank you. But you're just really great with languages, and you're so well-rounded academically. What I'm curious about, first of all, is what interested you as a young man in archaeology?
I don't even know how it happened, because I don't think these things happen normally. We had a teacher. I went to Sandia High School here in Albuquerque. We had a teacher who just so happened to be interested in archaeology. And he actually, in high school, offered an archaeology class one semester. And I think that was my senior year. And I took it, and I was absolutely hooked on it. And I went on to UNM to do a lot of ancient Near Eastern studies, but also anthropology, which was the traditional thing for a UNM student to major in. So I really liked that. I really enjoyed the connections of the Bible with the ancient world. And of course I was taught a lot of evolution. I guess I could say I majored in it. So I was really hooked up with evolutionary theory, with a lot of secular thinking. And I really didn't think too much about archaeology in the Bible until they came head to head. And if you stay in the field very long, in anthropology and archaeology, they do often come head to head with what the Bible claims.
Were you raised as a believer?
Yes.
Okay, so when you're going to school and that conflict started welling up and it was head to head, did you have a crisis of faith at that time?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I would say probably there was a time, I was sitting on the fence, it was about 50-50, because I really was being challenged regarding what I had always been asked to believe as a child or as a young person.
As opposed to what you've now discovered.
Yeah, and what I was being presented with. Because as college professors are wont to do, they will often purposefully, consciously challenge your traditional beliefs.
I remember.
And I mean, I was constantly being pounded with that. And so I started, for a long time I was questioning the Bible, but not questioning the anthropology. And all of a sudden I began to see that, well, maybe there should be a dialogue between those two things. It shouldn't be a one-way conversation. What about the questions I can ask the anthropologists? And I studied under some of the top guys here at UNM. And there were a lot of questions, frankly, they couldn't answer. Or they didn't have good, reasonable, logical answers. So my crisis of faith finally tipped, and really it was that the fact that the epicenter of world population growth, in the modern world, comes out of the Black and Caspian Sea area, that area of the Asian steppes between those two bodies of water, which just happens to be the site of the Urartu mountain range, the mountains of Ararat where Noah and his family landed. So the Bible nails the global epicenter of world population distribution. That's not a coincidence. So I started to look at the biblical text
You know,
in
it's
a lot different
interesting
light.
that you said, and you made a very important point, that you're questioning the Bible, but you thought it's time to question the anthropology. And I think a lot of young Christians, when they come to a crisis of faith in a university setting, immediately go to question the Bible, but never step into questioning intelligently the other side.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, I've just introduced a new concept for biblical archaeology. I'm actually doing a paper on it later this year at the Near East Archaeological Society conference called a dialogical approach to biblical archaeology. Whenever you have scientific data, field data, archaeological data, anthropological data, and you're working with the biblical text, if you're working in the same part of the world, same area, same time frame, same history, then you cannot let either one or the other, the Bible or the archaeology, simply speak univocally. Okay, and there can't just be one voice there. It has to be dialogue, because we cannot. And I think this is so important, Skip, because I think a lot of Christian scholars take almost, and I hate to even use this term to apply to someone thinking of my brothers, but sometimes their viewpoint on the biblical text is almost Mormonesque. And what I mean by that is that here you have, in Mormonism, you have a text, the Book of Mormon, that can't be supported by any archaeology,
yeah.
any science, by any stretch of the imagination. It's just
Right.
not going to happen. But a lot of times, even though we will critique the Mormons for doing exactly that, for taking exactly that stance, you know, the Book of Mormon is correct, but if anything in science or anything in any other knowledge base contradicts the Book of Mormon, it's of the devil and has to be wrong.
So it removes the dialogue.
So there's no dialogue. The beauty of the Bible is it did grow up in the real world. It did rise from the real space-time context. It is real history. Therefore, because it rises as if from the real historical ground, then we ought to be able to go to that same ground, investigate it, even excavate it, dig it, and discover relationships between that ground and the text. And sometimes we have to admit that the text is a little mysterious to us.
Yes.
That these ancient languages that have been around for thousands of years, that in themselves underwent many, many changes through time, just as language today. Mm-hmm. I mean, you've been all over the world. You know what happens when you go to English-speaking countries that still speak what we would call more archaic versions of English.
Yes.
Speak to a Scottish person and you can't understand a word they're saying, even though they're speaking English. Well, that was true in the ancient world as well. So we have even the same, for example, you can't put Moses and his brand of Hebrew in the same room with David and King David and his brand of Hebrew and have them have a discussion.
Right. It's very liquid. Language is very fluid.
They wouldn't be able to talk to each other. So we look at that and we say, well, there must be something wrong with the text. No, there's nothing wrong with the text. There is often perspectives and even information that we have wrong.
Lack of information.
And we can't interpret the text well.
Right.
Sometimes we have to sort of hold our interpretation in suspension. Say, well, here's what we think it says, but it could be this or something else.
Right.
And we have to let it be a little bit fluid.
Right.
Well, that bothers some people. But what I'm saying about archaeology is in this dialogical approach. Sometimes the question mark we have about the text can be removed by looking at the archaeology. And all of a sudden, a discovery in archaeology can illumine our mind and we go, oh, that's what they
meant.
that's what they were talking about. And all of a sudden it clears up.
Well, see, this is great. That's what's so great about you that I've noticed is that you've never been reactive. A lot of scholars, or a lot of believers in general, get very reactive when the world points a finger at them or questions something. You've always, whenever there's been a challenge, you encourage a dialogue. And in fact, you like welcome it. When somebody challenges it, you want to step into it with a smile, not a frown, and welcome the dialogue because you know you have enough experience with the discoveries that will be there once you make the correct observation. And you're secure enough to not worry about the digging and the questioning and the observation and the dialogue. Is that right? That's
Right.
a whole different approach, though.
Yeah, exactly. But why shouldn't it be that way? Why shouldn't we be excited about all the information from everybody's point of view?
Right.
Because none of us have everything in a box, sealed up, done. We know everything. No. But good science is good science, regardless of whether believer's doing it or unbeliever. Doesn't matter. As long as we're careful and we're honest, and we're logical and reasonable people. And I always say, I have that sin nature as well. And sometimes when I theorize about something and then all of a sudden in the excavation, and it actually turns out that way, it comes true, all of a sudden the evidence comes forth and it vindicates what you've been saying. And I just say, I really like being right. Yeah. I kind of whisper that to myself. And then God says, yeah, just keep it in perspective, buddy.
Well, let me ask you about being right, because you have been engaged in an archaeological investigation over a period of years over in the Middle East. And in effect, and I want to get around to this, in effect, you're saying that a lot of these books that are around us in this room are wrong, and you're right. And that is a very interesting prospect, given your desire to be balanced and honest and a scholar with integrity. You are interested and have been interested for a long time in what we would call biblical Sodom and Gomorrah, the cities of the plain. You came to a point years ago where you questioned the modern placement of those cities. What was the first kind of hint to you or suggestion that they may be wrong in where they have placed on the map in the back of the Bibles and in these tomes that we have around here, where Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities of the plain are? What first interested you in that?
This may sound radical, maybe shocking even to some people. I read the text. I mean, that was really where it came down.
Okay, but they read the text.
Yeah, but you and I, you lead tours to Israel and Jordan, I lead tours. And so just to sort of brush up on the story, a couple days before we went over across the border, I pulled out the biblical text and I read the text, Genesis 13 through 19, just read through it. And I got to the end of it and I thought, I don't see anything in there that would locate Sodom and Gomorrah toward the south end of the Dead Sea, where I'm about ready to take some folks and tell them this is Sodom and Gomorrah. Because see, I thought the very same thing about the location of Sodom that all the scholars do in all these books around us, okay? Because I'd read them. I didn't have really any substantive reason to reject what they had said. I just was going with the flow, like everybody else. So I thought, well, maybe I'll read it again. I read it about 4 times that night, and when I got to the end of about 4 readings of that text, I thought, not only is there nothing in the text that would locate Sodom toward the south into the Dead Sea, but everything I'm seeing in the text would locate it north of the Dead Sea, east of the Jordan River. And from that point on, I was involved in an excavation at the time in Israel. I wasn't looking for an excavation, wasn't looking for another project. But I just logged away this problem with Sodom's location. I thought, someday I'm going to deal with this. Well, when we shut down our excavation, that particular excavation in Israel in 2000, then immediately it came right back to my mind. And then I said, I got to write a paper on it, so I'll be forced to do the research. I scheduled a paper to read, and therefore I had to write it. And at that point, the ball started rolling. And by the way, at that point, I still wasn't looking for another excavation project.
Where were you excavating in Israel?
We were excavating at Ai.
Oh, yeah, right. I remember that.
10 miles north of Jerusalem. Sure. And that was very exciting. And by the way, it was the same textual analysis from Joshua 7 and 8 that we had done there to find the city of Ai and to excavate it. It was that same kind of idea, that same textual analysis method that we used on the biblical text to locate the city of Sodom.
I see. Now, Steve, don't you think, you'll tell me because I'm just guessing in the dark here, that a lot of the placement of these cities was done by people way before there was even credible archaeological evidence to support anything? They just sort of threw these places out on a map?
Yeah, that's typical because most biblical sites in the Old Testament, the majority of them, have not been excavated. So we can't say that even most of them have been confirmed by excavation. So how do they find them? They find them based on the geographical details embedded in the text.
Huh.
So, is it by this river, east of this city, by this mountain range, on the coast? Where is it? So you take all the biblical indicators for geography and you put it all together and you triangulate around and you go look for these big mounds of ruins.
Yes.
And you say, that must be it. Even if you don't excavate it, you can come up with a pretty good idea about its location.
You look at a tell, an artificial hill, typically, that's probably it.
Yeah.
And keep going
because of the geography in the text.
What led to you discovering the current place you're now digging as what you believe to be the biblical Sodom? Because it's not on what these maps are telling us.
We did a from scratch, from the recipe, from the text, a theoretical map that showed where Sodom and Gomorrah ought to be located. And now here you go, Skip. Here's this thing where we're going to be really scientific about this. Because if you ever come to the place where you throw the Bible open to scientific investigation, to be fair about it, it's got to be able to go one way or the other. The science has to come back and say, okay, it was wrong or it was right. The text was wrong or the text was right. And I had to ask myself that question to be fair. If I was going to tell these other guys who'd located Sodom toward the south end of the Dead Sea that they were, no pun intended, dead wrong, okay, if I was going to tell them that based on my research, then as I took that theoretical map that we'd drawn from the text and took it to Jordan and took it to the ground and compared and explored to see what we find there, if we didn't find any cities in that location that could coordinate with the time frame for Abraham and the biblical story, then we had a problem.
Now that's interesting. It's interesting because I always thought that you saw this place and you saw the tell, or it's in Arabic, tal, this artificial hill, and you said that must be Sodom. You actually, by looking at the text, came up with where you believed it ought to be and then went to see if something was there?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so...
And that, by the way, that's the proper way to do it.
Sure. I mean, that's...
Because you start, if you're going to test the text, then you have to let the text
tell you.
Say what it says without opinion, without any kind of bias or preconceived idea. So I took the biblical text independently, and I purposefully then locked myself out of the library, more or less, from that point of view. I wasn't going to read what anybody had to say about where Sodom was located. I was going to take the text.
Until later.
Later.
I want to bring that in. You did.
Later.
You've definitely done your homework and
Yeah.
research, but you wanted the text
But
to
at
direct
first,
your steps.
I wanted the text to be the only factor.
Wow, that's bold.
It was very detailed analysis of every word, every phrase, every sentence in context in the Hebrew, and carefully comparing it with the other Semitic languages and looking at every nuance of the text. And when I got to the end of it, I was very confident in this. We had a map, a theoretical map based on the biblical text that I felt couldn't be improved upon, really. I said, this map this is what the biblical text says. I was very confident. Now I was confident then. I'm totally convinced now.
Beautiful.
But I was so confident then of it that I had to make this statement: if we go to the field, remember I've never been there looking at it from this perspective. If we go to this location, and these cities are not there, then the Bible is mistaken. The biblical geography is mistaken, because this is where it puts it.
Did you say that out loud?
Yeah, to myself. But I had to go there. I said, well, if you're going to test,
If you're going to be objective and look at evidence,
that's always a little scary, but of course, then afterwards I was trying to find ways out of that. if I go there and they're not there, what's my loophole? And, you know, because I got to go back and face the community of faith. You know, how do I deal with that? Well, my out was, and this is pretty obvious, in my study of the destruction language of Sodom, the destruction of Sodom, the study of the language of destruction, the terms of destruction, I came to the conclusion that the language could accommodate anything from a garden variety burning, a typical burning of a city, garden variety fire, to a literal molecular disintegration. It would accommodate anything
Mega cataclysm.
from both extremes and anything in the center. Now that was my out. Well, what if I get there and the cities aren't there? Maybe they were completely and totally obliterated right down to the molecular level.
Okay, so
The text could tell us that we could get away with that.
okay.
So that was
So
my
you had a
loophole.
net. Okay, so here's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
Where is it? And when you first stood there, what was that like? And what started the dominoes tipping or the dots connecting at that point?
In a nutshell, it's located in a place in the crosshairs between what you can see from Bethel and Ai, because it said Lot and Abraham were hanging out at Bethel and Ai, which is 10 miles north of Jericho. I'm sorry, 10 miles north of Jerusalem, about 11, 12 miles northwest of Jericho, up on the escarpment, so about the same height as Jerusalem, maybe a little higher in elevation.
The escarpment being the Transjordan or the Judean hills?
The Transjordan.
Okay, yes.
I'm
On the
sorry.
other side.
I'm sorry. The Judean hills,
Right.
up on the top. So you have Jerusalem, and right north of that, 10, 12 miles north of that, is Bethel and Ai.
Okay.
That's where they were hanging out. Now that's slightly north of Jericho, and Jericho's right in that area of the Jordan Valley, north of the Dead Sea, in the Rift Valley. From there, it says Lot looked over and saw that the circle, the Kikar, the circle of the Jordan, was well watered. And he traveled eastward from that location as pitched his tent near Sodom. Now the text says pretty clearly that Lot could see the entire Kikar, the entire circle of the Jordan, and it says that Sodom was one of the cities of the Kikar, which means it was on the disk.
Okay.
Okay, and that he could see the entire disk from Bethel and Ai, which means he could see Sodom.
Oh.
Okay, if he could see the entire Kikar, then he could certainly see the cities of the Kikar, which back in that day would have been all probably painted white.
So help me here. Is he looking from that spine of mountains, the mountain range in the
very
center of the country,
tippy top.
and he's looking down toward east, toward the Jordan River,
Yeah.
and that's where he could spot that circle.
Yeah, and you can go stand there. By the way, that's where our excavation was in the 90s, at Ai.
So did you stand up there and look down and
Yeah,
did you from there first pinpoint the area?
you could see that area, but we just said, oh, you can see the Jordan Valley.
Right. What it looks like today.
We weren't really thinking about what was over there. But you can, by the way, you can physically from Bethel and Ai, from the highest hills around that area, you look over the Jordan Valley, you can see Tal Hammam with a naked eye.
When you
Easily,
first went
if
there,
you know what you're looking at.
when you first went to your site, and say it again, Tal
Tal
al-Hammam,
El Hammam.
which means?
Actually, it means the ruin. Tal means ruin. El Hammam means the spring or the baths.
Okay.
There is a Roman bath site built there because of the warm springs, and so the site is actually named after the Roman baths.
Okay, so when you first went there and you stood in that area, did you see that artificial hill, the ruins of an ancient civilization?
Yes, but we actually, the first thing we do in archaeology when we get on the ground is go to the library. Remember I said I didn't do any background research at all based on this theoretical map.
Right.
Or for this theoretical map. But when we actually got to the exploration phase, first thing we did was we went to Amman, Jordan, and to the ACOR Library, American Center of Oriental Research, and start pulling any surveys, archaeological reports, because we had looked at American sources, Israeli archaeological sources, European sources, and we could find nothing from the Middle Bronze Age, from the time of Abraham, on their maps.
Huh.
All of this stuff about the archaeology of the area, of that particular area, was under the radar. But in Jordan, we began to find lots of information. Some excavations were going on at Tel Nimreen to the north and other sites. And all of a sudden, I think within an hour of being at the Acor Library on our first trip in 2002, after writing that paper and getting our theoretical map together, within an hour, we had too many Bronze Age sites.
You had what?
Too many sites.
Too many sites for...
Yeah, looking at the literature, looking at the survey reports, all of a sudden we had too many sites. We went from no sites that could date to the time of Abraham and could be the cities of the plain, which was worrying me. I had a little doubt in the back of my mind going, why is there not anything from the Middle Bronze Age, from Abraham's time, in that piece of real estate? Could never see it on the maps. However, when we got to Jordan and we started digging deeper in the unpublished material, now it had been published, but it hadn't been brought to light. That part of it had not really been published or studied. And so as we were going through this more or less raw material and looking at it, I got pretty excited because after an hour, we were now looking at 14 major archaeological sites in the area that could date to the time of Abraham. Now we had too many. Before we got there, we didn't have any.
So this is all research before you got to the site?
Yeah. I didn't even know Tal Hammam existed.
Okay, so when you got there, this is what I'm trying to reconstruct. When you got to this site that we're talking about, when did the excitement kick in and you were thinking at what point, oh my goodness, this is it? They've all been wrong.
Yeah.
When was that?
Very specific. We took all those 14 sites. And by the way, now we know there are even more, but there are a lot of smaller sites. We were focusing on the big ones because when it talks about Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, you figure these are the more prominent ones.
Because they're mentioned in the
Because
text.
they're mentioned. Some of the smaller daughter towns and villages may not be mentioned. So we looked at all of these 14 archaeological sites and we were looking at their dimensions from being surveyed, and we picked out the ones that size-wise seemed to be the most prominent ones.
Okay, makes sense.
Okay?
Okay, so what you're talking about is a city that's the largest, and it goes back in all of those ages. In other words, it was inhabited as a large area, a large city, for a long time, way, way back, which means it's a prominent city, and at that time, maybe the prominent city in the area.
Right. Now that we've done 6 years of excavation at the site, we know that it was continuously occupied on its entire footprint. We're talking about 36 hectares, you're talking about pushing 80 acres plus in the fortified city.
And what were average cities? How big were they in comparison?
Jericho's 10 times smaller than that.
Really? 10 times smaller.
And
so
Jerusalem.
your dig...
For example, David and Solomon's Jerusalem, at its biggest expanse, between, say, 12 and 15 acres.
On that
Most
little
people
hill.
Most people say about 10 acres for the city of David.
And you're talking about 80
12 acres for, and we're talking about 80. So Tal Hammam, Sodom, dwarfs most of the biblical sites that you know about.
Did you have any idea how big it was when you first started digging?
No. In fact, the upper tell is so big that it looks like the tell, and there's nothing else there. But when you start looking at the surrounding terrain and you get down on it, you see that the lower tell, which looks perfectly flat from up there, is actually standing as high above the lower terrain as the upper tell is above the lower tell.
Interesting.
Which is it just blows me away.
Upper tell versus lower tell. Upper tell is the most recent, and then the lower tell is the earliest civilization?
The upper tell exists because there's a spur of a hill underneath it. So the first inhabitants probably went up there and began to build up there because of protection.
Other, like Bet Shean, is the same idea,
Yeah,
right?
you
Upper
get this,
tell and a lower
exactly,
city. Lower, okay.
Exactly. So you have this upper city, and of course, when when the city expands and gets much, much larger than the upper tell, then the lower tell, by the way, is about, I'd say, at least 5 times bigger than the upper tell. Now, well, at least. And so as the city grows, the upper tell becomes the place where the palaces are built. I mean, the king wants to live up and above everything else.
He wants the view.
So it becomes the real high dollar real estate.
Location.
And so the king is up there, and all of his cronies are up
And
there.
you can look
on the
down
top
on
of the hill.
everybody.
And by the way, you can see, there's no place on the whole of the site that you can go that you can't see from the king's palace, because we now know where the king's palace is.
Wow.
So it was very exciting. So when I had that thing on the radar now, there it is. Obviously, everybody agrees it's the biggest archaeological site in the Jordan Valley. We need to check that out. Well, I purposely put that, it was on the top of my list, but I purposefully saved it for last. So now we had to get in the car and go find every single one of these archaeological sites. And believe me, that was not easy, because the directions on a lot of the surveys were not very good. So it was pretty late in the evening, because the sun's not going down until about 9 or so or later. And the only one left on the list is Tal Hammam. Haven't seen it yet.
Wow.
And so knowing now what all the other sites look like, and some of them were pretty tall, 100 feet tall, very impressive looking. We got to this site, and as we drove toward it, and I actually, at first, I didn't know what I was looking at. It was so big that you think you're looking at the nearby hills. You're looking at a spur of the nearby hill.
You think it's just a natural
outcropping
of
it's
rock.
just so big. It doesn't look like a tell, because all the other ones we've been looking at, several of them could fit on top of this one site. So as soon as I realized what I was looking at, and I saw how big, and again, remember, at this point, I didn't know that the lower tell really existed, or really what it consisted of. All I had seen were descriptions of the upper tell. I saw that thing, and it was unbelievable. I just stood there, my jaw just dropped. It was me, Danette, my wife, and a couple of friends of ours that had gone. They'd helped with the research in Amman. And so we were all standing there just looking at this thing going, my goodness, this thing is huge. Well, we walked up on top, stood on the top of this thing, and at all the other sites we had been to, you couldn't get there was no, when you stood on the top of it, you couldn't get a dominant sense of the terrain and the position of this,
the positioning
of the site
as a dominant city.
Relative to the terrain.
Right.
But when you get to the top of Tal Hammam, we go out to the west end that overlooks the Jordan Valley, and you stand there, and the first thing that hits you is, oh my, this guy's king of the world.
Wow. So this was the top dog area to be.
And not only that, I look up to my right over to the Judean hills, and I can see the little towers of the Israeli settlement Psagod, which is where Bethel and Ai, the area where Bethel and Ai are located. I can see that with my naked eye. I'm standing at this location, and I start playing through the biblical story and the biblical geography, where Lot came. And as I played through it, I went, this has to be it. Where else would Sodom be but right here? It's exactly east of Jericho, same level.
Okay.
If he travels eastward, which it says he did, from Bethel and Ai, Lot would come directly to this location.
Okay.
This city is, and we didn't know the totality of this then, but we know it now. It's sitting right on the crossroads of all the regional trade routes of that area. The north-south route, the east-west route cross right at that location.
So whatever it was, you know it has to be the prominent city in that area.
It is.
Okay.
Period.
That's the evidence.
Now, on the other side of that coin, you have the biblical statements that are pretty clear. I mean, the text does not say Sodom was the biggest city.
Right. It's just mentioned.
Okay. But it's always mentioned first.
And that's typically the biggest city,
the biggest city.
or the most prominent.
It's the only one of that group ever mentioned by itself. The others are only mentioned in a list of the cities of the plain. That one is mentioned, Sodom is mentioned alone on numerous occasions. The king of Sodom is the only king amongst those cities that has a voice. He actually speaks to Melchizedek, with Melchizedek and Abram. Remember, he has that little conversation.
Yep.
And so one could easily determine that Sodom was the biggest city of those cities in the Bible. Well, if Sodom was the biggest city on the eastern Jordan Disk during the time of Abraham, that is during the Middle Bronze Age, then if this city we were standing on was in fact the largest ruin on the eastern Jordan Disk, the largest ancient city on the eastern Jordan Disk in the Middle Bronze Age, it had to be Sodom. I mean, there are 100 other reasons, but that was the nuts and bolts of it.
Gotcha.
That was very simple, it was very straightforward. And by the way, every single scholar who's had doubts or even extreme skepticism about our site being biblical Sodom, every single one of them who has come out to the site that I have walked with up to the top of our site and then told the story from the biblical text, same thing happens to them as happened to me.
Wow.
Their jaw drops. They said, I have no idea.
Wow. That's it.
In fact, Dr. Lane Rittmeyer, who's the world's leading authority on archaeology at the Temple Mount, and
yes,
he's the premier architectural reconstruction artist for almost every
I've seen his
excavation
work for years.
in Israel and now in Jordan. And he's working with us in Jordan. First time I brought him out to the site, we went up to the top, I stood, we talked about the story, and he shook his head and he said, I had no idea. I had no idea. He said, all I'd ever heard was that Collins thinks Tal al-Hammam is biblical Sodom and he won't listen to anybody else.
Now he knows why.
Yeah, and so it was just sort of like an aha moment for him, any scholar that I've taken up there. It's just,
Great.
all of a sudden you realize that the biblical geography is so real and so present and being played out right there before your eyes. Mm-hmm. In fact, Lane had never been down to Babadra Numera, the traditional sites that I was taking folks to years before as Sodom. And so while we were there just a few weeks ago, we got in our car and we drove down to Babadra Numera. And we walked through, and Lane and I were looking at the architecture and the walls and the fortifications of the temple, and it's a nice site. And Lane was commenting how wonderful the site, how important that site was, and he'd never seen it before, and he was just thrilled that we were able to go there. And but he said, "There's no way this is Sodom." That was sort of the final nail in the coffin.
Well, now
for
you've
him.
got a hurdle you have to cross over, and that is, why has that been the traditional Sodom? If that's true, what you're saying, why is it that for years that was assumed to be, and the majority of scholarship placed it there?
If you look at most of the explorer scholars of the 19th century, people like Merrill and Condor and Tristram and Merrill, I think I said Merrill, but there's a whole bunch of them. They took their Bibles, Genesis 13, 1 through 12, they read it, they followed it, and they found the sites north of the Dead Sea. It was really W.F. Albright. He was the most powerful Near Eastern biblical archaeology scholar of the 20th century. Albright really had the power. And he decided, without analysis of the text, he never gave us an analysis of the text.
Okay.
Never. But the Bible scholars loved Albright. So every commentator, every Bible dictionary writer, encyclopedia writer, they all went with Albright. Whatever Albright said was gospel. And so if he said it, that's where it is. That's where we wound up. That's where everybody went. And so it didn't matter. It was south because Albright said it, not because the Bible said it.
So they made the mistake by not following the biblical text.
That's
Is that
right.
what you're saying?
Exactly.
Okay, so now fast forward, because we only have a couple minutes left. This last season, you've been doing it a number of years. It takes a long time to uncover a site. You have been now highlighted by the Director General of Archaeology of the country of Jordan. Tell us about that.
With the coming of a new Director General just this last year to the department, he has recognized from, I think, a very profound scientific base. He's an excellent scientist, he's won several awards as a scientist. He's looked at he was the first one, by the way, from the Department of Antiquities to come to me and say, I want to see everything you've got. I want to see your biblical evidence. I want to see your historical evidence. I want to see your archaeological evidence, your everything. I want you to throw it all at me.
Yes, and did he, after seeing it, what did he say? He said something, and I want to hear it from you before we lose the tape on this.
I think he's pretty well convinced. Now, he's a scientist.
Yes.
But I think from the evidence, I think he's pretty well convinced that we are at least the forerunner for the location of biblical Sodom. If that's true, then what he has stated, and I think he would stand behind this, is that that would make the Tal Hammam excavation project and what we're excavating one of the most important, if not the most important, archaeological discovery in history. And to me, that's pretty exciting to go from where we were to that. And he's also told our team that we are now one of the most important archaeological sites in Jordan. And that has, by the way, from an archaeological and historical point of view, we've known all along, because of the information we're discovering, it's not just about Sodom. It's about 2,500 years of Bronze Age history in the southern Jordan Valley that nobody's ever seen before. Oh, so, I mean, it's a huge wealth of material. So we've known all along that the Tal Hammam excavation project has been one of the most important pieces of research and excavation being done in Jordan, period. We've known that. So, but now that is being recognized officially by the Department of Antiquities in Jordan. And but I think they're doing that for very, very good, solid, evidential scientific reasons.
How many years have you done it now? 6 years, you say?
We've been in the field 6 years. And
how many people have participated?
By the way, we just signed a new joint scientific project agreement with the Department of Antiquities for another 10 years.
You had no idea, did you, when you wrote that little paper about that would occupy a huge chunk of your life?
No, not just a huge chunk. It just like almost took over my whole life.
It's really consumed you.
Yeah.
in a great way, though. I mean, what you're adding to the church and to scientific knowledge as a believer is huge. So how many people have participated in this dig?
Several hundred. We've had couple of seasons where we had over 100 volunteers and up to 70, 80. So hundreds of people have come with us. But what's fun about it is so many of those people, I say way over half, are repeats for multiple years because people get hooked on excavating. It's a wonderful experience.
I want to thank Dr. Stephen Collins for being with us. Steve, thank you so much.
Thanks, Skip.
Appreciate it. Appreciate all your hard work. And we hope that people will not only get informed by this, but also want to contribute either by going on one of the tours that he conducts, help dig it up, and even financially help out with that project. It takes a lot of years, a lot of time, and a lot of money to get that done. So we hope that comes your way. God bless you.
Thanks, Skip.